Okay, well, we're here to talk about drugs. I'm Richard Kravitz. I'm director of UC Center Sacramento, and it's really great to have you all here for this next episode of our Capital Insights program, this time focusing on drug pricing with help from our colleagues at UCSF, as well as Consumer Reports and UC Hastings. In a moment, I'll turn the microphone over to Adam Studley, who will tell you how the program will proceed in detail. But for right now, just in general terms, we'll have presentations by the speakers sequentially for a period of time, followed by a very extensive question and answer period. And after we're all done with questions and answers, we can all move to the adjacent room for a reception that includes both food and beverages. I'm really excited about this program because drug prices are basically of interest to anyone who ever visits a pharmacy. Drugs account, as probably everyone in this room knows, for only about 10 or 11% of total healthcare expenditures nationally, but they've been rising faster than practically any other component of the healthcare index, and for the reason I alluded to before, because we all are involved in pharmaceutical purchasing for ourselves or our families. It's something that really hits home, really hits the wallet. So it's an area of great interest, an area of controversy, an area where perhaps the state of California can do something. So to find out more about that, we look forward to hearing from the panel, and to introduce them, Adam Studley.
Thanks, Richard, and thanks to the UC Center for having us. As Richard said, I'm Adam Studley. I'm the director of the Center for Healthcare Value at UCSF, and also the associate director of the Philip R. Lee Institute for Health Policy Studies. And we're fortunate today to have a panel that can give you a perspective, can give you multiple different perspectives. So you are going to hear from me, but first you're going to hear from Lisa Gill, who is deputy editor at Consumer Reports and runs their Best Buy Drugs program and many other special projects. And she's going to give you some information about the consumer experience and some thoughts about the consumer perspective on drug prices. Then I will talk to you a little bit. I'm a lung doctor, and I'll talk to you a little bit about the clinical perspective on high drug price situations, and when drugs seem to be high value and high priced, and when they're low value and still high priced. And then Robin Feldman is professor of law and director of the Institute for Innovation Law at UC Hastings, and she'll talk to us about how some of the policy decisions that we've made as a society play into the current prices of drugs, and then we'll all talk about options, policy options for changing the current situation. So, Lisa?
Thank you all so much for being here. This is really an honor to be invited, and it's an honor to talk about this topic and to really share our work, what we've done at Consumer Reports in the area of pharmaceuticals and pricing and costs. I'm Lisa Gill. I've been at Consumer Reports. I'm working on my 10th year. I'm very proud to say that. And I come to this discussion as a journalist. I do not have a pharmaceutical background or a medical background, but we work intensely with pharmacists, pharmacy organizations, doctors, different evidence-based practice centers to come up with the information I'm going to share with you today. We also have an in-house team of amazing statisticians that also help us arrive at a lot of the good stats. A couple quick things. So, we opened this discussion in thinking about drug prices, but we have been looking at the cost, like the actual, what a person pays out of pocket, because that is, to us, where the first part of this burden or the first part of this story unfolds. Okay. And to set it all up, the first stat that we found was that it's widely reported in the media that it's about $320 billion are spent every year on medications in what's called the ambulatory setting, and that's at a retail pharmacy. But that's the number we refuse to report because it's actually higher than that. It's $424 billion, And that is before all the discounts are paid, all the back and forth, all the bonuses and other rebates and things. So that's how much money flows through the system. And it's not maybe surprising then to learn that according to basically our nationally representative telephone surveys, that half of all adult Americans take an average of 4 to 5 medications, which is a lot. That's just prescription. Our evidence also suggests, as you would not be surprised to hear, people take 1 to 2 over-the-counter drugs and maybe 1 to 2 vitamins or supplements. Okay. Part of the Best Buy Drugs program at Consumer Reports, we don't take any advertising or corporate donations of any kind. We only take subscriptions, individual donations, and grants. And I work on a grant project, and part of that project is using data like secret shopper data or nationally representative surveys to help us really understand what's a consumer's experiencing. So a recent one that we did back in March was that we asked them all kinds of things, but one of the things we asked them was, hey, when you go fill a prescription, how much are you spending? How many drugs are you taking? And oh, by the way, have any of your costs gone up in the last 12 months? And it turned out that 1 out of every 4 people who answered said that yes, they were paying more out of pocket for at least one medication. And then it wasn't just a little amount either. It was on the order of about $50 extra, and that's just in one specific drug that we asked about. I should say too that a quarter of people is somewhere around 28 million people face that problem in the last year, and that's for us been a showstopper. It made us really sit in conference rooms and on conference calls asking, what does that mean to people when a drug cost goes up? So a couple things. These reasons for you all who study in this area may not be surprising, but a lot of consumers don't realize why they may get to a pharmacy and all of a sudden a drug that was $10 one month is suddenly $40 or $50 the next month. And I'll go through them quickly, but the first one is high deductible insurance plans. 4 out of every 10 people have a plan like that, usually through their employer. And that means that they typically spend anywhere from $2,000 to $4,000 first out of pocket before any of their benefits kick in. In some cases, we have talked with families around the country whose deductible is in the order of $12,000 or $15,000 before they ever reach any pharmacy benefit. So they're basically paying cash prices and sometimes actually inflated cash prices. That's the first problem. The second problem is formulary changes. People don't realize what a formulary is. They don't understand tiering on a formulary. And so when they get that letter in the mail that says your drug moved from tier 1 to tier 3, they may not realize that just means it went from $10 a month to $50, $60 or higher, or worse, it's a co-insurance or co-share. So they may wind up at the pharmacy counter and not understanding why all of a sudden they're paying more money for the same old drug. Third thing is actual high prices of drugs, which my colleagues will talk quite a bit about. Those high prices have changed how much people pay, have increased how much people have to pay for their premiums, and changed also put a lot of pressure on those formularies. Okay, so we started to look at, well, what happens when that cost goes up? And we found that people do some pretty dangerous things, and there is actual real suffering as a result, both financial suffering and health suffering. So in a survey that we did about 1.5 years ago, we called more than 4,000 people, and about 2,000 of them took regularly prescription medication. And part of our entire sort of effort was to understand, again, how many drugs they took, how were they acquiring them, were they sharing them, were they taking expired meds, did they ever talk to their doctors about how much that drug costs. What we learned is that if their costs had gone up, 47% of those people had done something that was unsafe. They split medications, they shared them, they didn't fill prescriptions, versus 27% of people who did things that were unsafe but whose costs did not go up. Okay. I broke out, this slide and the next slide sort of break out differences between people whose drug prices, their drug costs had gone up a little bit or a lot, and this versus people whose prices did not change. You can see that 30% report that they did not fill the prescription because they could not afford it, versus 11% who also didn't fill prescriptions, but they just simply couldn't afford them. 17% skipped a dose. 13% cut pills in half without checking with a doctor or pharmacist. By the way, 30% of people, it translates to actually between like 4 and 6 million people. And I just want you to think about that for a minute. Most of us in this room are probably decently insured, either through our employer or through university or other places that we work. But folks who are trying to purchase medications who cannot afford them and walk away from the counter because they can't afford a drug that they have to take. That's I just can never get over that. It's like a drug that they have to take all the time for something that's probably a life-saving medication, and suddenly they cannot afford it. Okay, this one is not only did they have cost problems, but you could see that when one medication increased, it triggered other issues. People told us they skipped going to doctor visits because the cost was too high. They skipped a test or a procedure, and many more people used the manufactured discount coupons as a result of not being able to afford medications. And if you look at the differences, it's almost double in all cases. All right, the next thing is we asked not just that, but we asked how did a higher drug cost affect your household finances? And the one number that always jumps out at me is how many people had to cut back on necessities like groceries. I only identified groceries, but we asked a lot of other questions. People spent less money on entertainment and meals, as you can imagine. However, they wound up using credit cards much more often if they had one of their drug costs increase. Basically, people had to reshuffle their personal finances in order to afford these meds. So through our work, we try to come up with what we call hacks. These are not systemic solutions to this problem, but we try to give consumers what are some quick things that they could do right now that would help them lower their medication costs. The first one that we determined, and it seems obvious, but it's actually not, and that is simply to make sure that you're only taking the medications that you actually need. Now, for a long time, I thought that sounded kind of ridiculous. I assumed that the things that people took, they are obviously checking in with their doctors or their pharmacists, and that was the deal. But it turns out that when we did another nationally representative survey a couple of months ago, we learned that if people asked their doctor, so not everybody does it, only about half of the people do it, but if they'd ever asked a healthcare provider, hey, can I stop any of my medications? Almost 3/4 of the time, they were able to quit something. The doctor basically deprescribed them. So that is substantial, especially for people that are older, or if you take multiple medications, you know that even going from 5 medications to 4 substantially lowers your risk of any sort of adverse drug event or side effect, and also lowers your cost. So we have taken this on really as a banner issue and trying to make sure that appropriate prescribing is part of this discussion, and making sure that people understand that they may not need something they're taking, and to keep asking. Ask your pharmacist, ask your doctor every time you go to a doctor visit, and also a pharmacy visit. Okay. Second one, this also seems, to me, always seemed obvious, but it's not at all. The cost discussion between a patient and a physician is, I would say, it's an evolving one, but it still has a long way to go. We did an online poll of about 200 internal medicine doctors last year, and we asked all about, well, how do you think about cost? Do you think about it at all? And as you might expect, it's the last thing that they consider, often because they don't know. They'll tell you they don't know what the cost is, and they don't really have time to find out. Well, from a patient standpoint, it also that lack of that discussion means that a patient may walk away with orders for a test or a procedure or a drug and not really know what the cost is until they get to that location, to the hospital, to an outpatient clinic, or to a pharmacy. And that's not the moment to decide what to do. It's really at the moment at the doctor's office. So we've tried to encourage those conversations. They're not always perfect, and it's true the doctors do not have a lot of time to make those phone calls, but they are essential, and we're all going to have to work together to help inform that conversation and make sure that people can afford their treatments. Okay. Number 3, this was you may be aware that places like Walmart, CVS, Sam's Club, Kroger, basically every retail chain in the country has hundreds of generic drugs that are available without insurance that you can get for as little as $4 for 1 month or $10 for 3 months. Now, these programs are not perfect, but they can offer people who have, maybe they're on a high deductible plan or sort of just questionable coverage is too expensive. It gives them an option. Also, these plans, not really a plan, these generic drug programs, they don't cover every single generic or every single strength, but they cover the most common. And we encourage people to at least ask the pharmacist, is my drug on any of your discount lists? Because it's not uncommon that 1 or 2 may be there. Number 5, I'll come back to number 4 in a second, because this is like the most controversial. So in thinking about those $4, $10 programs, we also encourage consumers to not automatically assume that their insurance is the best deal. And there's a lot of interesting reasons for that. But one of the things our secret shoppers have found is if you ask a pharmacist, what is your lowest possible price? Am I getting the best deal possible? You can see additional discounts off of a retail price. And sometimes in certain stores, even within the same zip code, that retail price may be lower than your insurance copay. And if you have a high deductible plan where you're paying out the full amount anyway, and you may feel like you're never going to reach that deductible, a $10 generic Lipitor at Costco may be your better option. So we encourage people, ask the question, is this the lowest possible price? Don't necessarily assume that your insurance is going to give you the best price. And the third thing on that list is consider using a site like GoodRx or BlinkHealth.com as a comparator site, so that you type in your zip code, you can see, especially GoodRx is quite good at this, you can see across the board what all the different stores in your area charge for the retail price. Okay, now I'm going back to number 4. The last one is, I also generally assume that people were taking medications that were the lowest price or the generic versions whenever possible, but that's not always the case either. We talked to a woman last year who emailed us and said, I have terrible migraines and my doctor put me on a drug called SACRAMENT, but it's so expensive. My insurance doesn't cover it very well, and it's hundreds of dollars a month. And actually, yesterday, before we gathered for the first time, I took a look at how much SACRAMENT costs right now. You could buy it at healthwarehouse.com for $834. So if you think, oh, maybe it's a cure or it's like the most wonderful migraine treatment, but it's actually not. It's an old drug, sumatriptan, combined with a drug everybody knows, naproxen, which you could get for $16 for sumatriptan and $6 for naproxen. So we let her know, we don't know why your doctor has put you on SACRAMENT, but you should really spend just $32 and get basically the same thing. My email, when I have discussions like these, I love to talk to people afterwards. So if you want slides or any of the data, or you want to tell me I'm wrong or there's a way to improve it, I would love to hear from you. So definitely, it's lgill@consumer.org. Thank you.
So I'm going to talk to you about the clinical situations in which new drugs are introduced, and they're not all the same, and the drugs that are introduced are not all the same. So sometimes a drug really is a game changer from a clinical standpoint, and can cure a disease or can significantly improve quality of life if you have to live with a disease. And other times it's a very small increment in terms of what we can do for people who are suffering. And yet we see high prices in numerous different situations. I'll start by positing that we're going to talk about policy as this panel goes on, and we ought to consider that policy doesn't have to be the same. Right now, a patent is a patent, and they're the same length, but it doesn't have to be that way. That's not actually in the Constitution. Patents are in the Constitution, but how long they are is a non-constitutional policy. It's a law, and we can change those things. And we can make them more flexible. And then I'm going to address a common refrain that you hear in debates about drug prices from drug manufacturers, which is that the prices don't actually matter because no one pays them. And when price increases occur, that there will be accompanying discounts, and no one really knows that the price increases matter at all. And so we'll look at data as to whether or not that is correct. So first, I'll just highlight that this is not a small problem. Lisa told you about how many people and how many prescriptions and how much money, but I just want to highlight an international comparison. So other countries that are developed countries, good places to live, actually have much lower drug prices than we do. And so it is at least possible that a developed nation could adopt a set of policies that left it in a different place than we find ourselves. And the United Kingdom, for instance, for a market basket of drugs, pays a little bit less than half what we pay. I also, since I'm trying to tee up policy issues, I want to highlight how many people are involved in this market. So from the outside, it might look like you've got the patient who needs the drug manufacturer who needs it, and the pharmacy where they pick it up. And of course, the drug manufacturer should get paid, and the pharmacy should get paid. Many people don't realize how many other parties there are between the drug manufacturer and the patient. And so this is just an example of a payment stream where the patient pays $25 and the insurer on behalf of the employer pays $232 in, so you get a total of $257 in. And then it doesn't go, that's not $257 split between the manufacturer and the pharmacy, but rather there's a pharmacy benefit manager in between that gets payments in a variety of forms. The pharmacy gets some payment. There's a drug wholesaler in between, which isn't the same as the pharmacy benefit manager necessarily. And then often there's a rebate to the insurer. Sometimes this gets shared with the employer, and often it stays primarily or entirely with the insurer. So for the money that comes in from really just two parties, the patient and the employer, or if it's a government program, the government, it gets spread out broadly, and we need to keep that in mind as we're thinking about how to address the system. Okay, so now let's look at our clinical situations. This first one, the headline looks bad, $1,000 pill for hepatitis C. And it got a lot of attention, but it may not actually be quite as bad as some other examples that will come later, because this drug was a cure for hepatitis C. So you took what was a chronic disease and you made it go away. If you can imagine the savings, for instance, people may not know that much about hepatitis C, but imagine if you could make all the problems of diabetes just stop. How the potential savings that might be generated down the road if people didn't need to keep checking their blood sugar and didn't have complications where they lost their vision or needed to get checked for losing their vision, or kidney disease or heart attacks, or all the things that can happen. And the chronic problems that develop from hepatitis C are different. You can get liver cancer and cirrhosis, but they're expensive, and you can end up with really expensive things like needing a liver transplant. And so if an innovator can come in and introduce something that cures a disease that has a lot of downstream costs, that there's enormous value to society in their doing that. There's also a problem for them in trying to recoup their costs of developing a drug, and that is, if you come up with a cure, then you sort of work yourself out of a job, because you fix the people that are the market that you were trying to get into. And so if you are going to recoup your costs, you actually need to recoup them up front. And so what you ended up seeing was the decision by the manufacturer of the new drug that to recoup their investment, they were going to price it at $84,000 for the treatment. As it turned out, it was a 12-week treatment, 7 days a week. That's 84 days. And so it came out to exactly $1,000 a pill, and that's what led to the headlines. I'm not saying that it was right, or that being at $84,000 for that treatment course is the right place, or reflects optimal policy decisions. I'm just saying that, at least in this case, while we're paying a lot, we're also getting a lot. That contrasts with some other conditions or some other situations that we see in healthcare today. So the amount that we're paying, the dollars we're paying per year of life saved in cancer drugs, has increased substantially over the last 10 years, really over the last 20 years, now to the point where some drugs that we're seeing on the far right, that's time on the x-axis, and some drugs to the far right, we're paying over $500,000 per year of life saved. And if we adopted that kind of approach to paying for drugs broadly, since that's much more than the average person makes, their economic output per year of life lived, there's no way that this can be affordable. And cancer writ large, all the different kinds of cancers rolled up, very common disease. So if this is what we're going to opt for, policies that leave us at $500,000 per year of life saved for cancer, it's going to be very difficult for society to support that over time. So that sounds bad, but this is perhaps even worse. This is a new antibiotic that was introduced that has been shown the main thing that's been shown is that it increases mortality when you use it. So a black box was added to the labeling. And afterwards, the manufacturer just increased the price by 20%. So it's the rare market where a major defect, one as bad as you'll kill your customer, can be identified and widely reported, and the solution is to raise the price. I don't know what the thinking was, but perhaps it went something along the lines of, well, we're not going to sell as much of this now, so if we're going to recoup our investment, we need to raise the price. Yet another situation is when there's a drug that has been around for a while, the generics, and yet still the price seems to increase rapidly. So the example of Martin Shkreli and Turing Pharmaceuticals and Daraprim got the most initial headlines. The EpiPen example also got a lot of headlines. So an EpiPen contains epinephrine, which has been around for decades, and at the time that Mylan, the company that did all the price increases, bought it, had been generic for a long time. The drug is in an injector, so the patient can administer it to themselves. The development of that injector was largely paid for by the U.S. government that was looking for battlefield treatments and wanted an injector to cover a variety of different options or different possibilities that might arise on the battlefield. So it's a generic drug in something that society already paid for which society already paid the development costs, and yet its price was increasing rapidly over the last 12 years or so. And it was doing it mainly in the United States. So the big bar, it doesn't matter what the actual prices here it's the relative thing I want you to see. The big bar is the United States, and the little tiny bar over there is the UK, and the smaller bars in between, still way less than half, are France and Germany. So this is another example of highly or developed economies. Other developed economies are able to get very different drug prices through a very different set of policies about innovation and drug markets than the United States has. A thing that gets far less attention but actually is even bigger in percentage terms and often, if it got attention, would seem even more outrageous is that hospitals buy lots of drugs, and if drugs that hospitals use get in short supply, there are rapid, very large increases in prices to purchase them. If this were batteries after a hurricane in Texas or Florida, well, I mean, you saw the people who raised the price of their milk and water get excoriated on national TV after the hurricane in Texas. But they were raising the prices 50% or 75%. And the reason it got so much attention was because the public could see it. In the hospital industry, the prices are thousands of %, and it can be for stuff as even more simple than batteries. So there was a crisis at one point in the manufacture of saline. That's just the saltwater bags that you hang to run the drugs through, and sometimes you give it to people if they're dehydrated. So it's potentially life-saving, but it's never more than salt and water. and it's never expensive to make. And yet you saw the price of saline go up by thousands of percent. And then the last situation is when there's no innovation at all. So it's not a generic issue. It's the transition from brand to generic. And manufacturers have at times opted to pay generic potential manufacturers. So the original brand manufacturer has opted to pay potential generic manufacturers to delay the introduction of generic drugs. And we've adopted a set of policies that allows the following to happen. A manufacturer pays and is found guilty of illegally paying in a pay-for-delay settlement, gets $4 billion in revenues and pays $125 million in penalties, and then doesn't even feel bad about it. Feels like that was clearly the right thing to do, and our board and Wall Street are happy about it. And we set up the policies that allow that kind of thing to happen. And so again, it's a choice. It doesn't have to be that way. So now let's switch gears a little bit and ask, when prices increase, who pays? This is apropos of some of the conversations that that happened around, for instance, the EpiPen. We analyzed claims from a group of insurance companies. I'm not allowed to tell you who, but it was a national sample with tens of millions of claims involved. And it is true. And we looked at the top 25 drugs for which commercial insurers paid the most in 2014. And then among those, we sorted out, because we were going to look at changes over a 5-year period, we threw out those where there was a change where you'd expect the price to increase. So for instance, if a brand drug went generic. So we ended up with 15 drugs that we were going to take a look at. And there were indeed discounts for all of those drugs. And sometimes they were large, but on average they're about 25%. So it is true when they say that there are discounts and that people rarely pay the list price. However, if you look at changes in list price and changes in what is paid, the red line is change in the list. I'm sorry, the blue line is the change in the list price, and the red line is the change in the sum of what the consumer paid, what the patient paid, and what their insurer paid, after discounts and after rebates. And what you see is, in fact, when the list price goes up, the total amounts paid go up right along with it. Quite tight correlation there. It's a topic that's, the prices are a topic that we need to talk a lot about, but not all the situations are the same. And there are big differences in how much value we're getting, and we might want to have different policies for different situations. But when we do talk about it, we ought to talk about it openly and honestly and with transparency as much as possible. And one of the things that we've learned, I should have highlighted, I suppose, it was difficult to get all those prices that you just saw, because we have, again, a set of rules that allow people to not be transparent about what their prices are. So it's a part of the market that's difficult to respond to and manage. But when we do talk about it, we should try as much as possible to be honest about things. And it's clear that list prices matter a lot. And that was for people with insurance, by the way. So obviously, people who don't have insurance, the list price is what they pay. So there really probably isn't any part of the market where the list price doesn't matter a lot and where changes in the list price don't matter a lot. So thank you. And Robin?
It's nice to be here. I'm Professor Robin Feldman. I am a professor of law and director of the Institute for Innovation Law at UC Hastings. I get to go third, So hopefully I can keep your attention. I think I will. In particular, I have some data to show you that we just released yesterday and that has made a big splash. It was carried as breaking news by Bloomberg, and I've heard based on that from people all over the world about it in the last day. So I get to share hot off the presses with you as well. So as others on the panel have noted, headlines, medicines are making headlines these days, not for their ability to save lives, but for their skyrocketing prices. So prices for the 30 best-selling drugs have risen 8 times faster than inflation, and the cost of prescription medicine is growing faster than any other form of healthcare spending, and that includes hospitalization and nursing care. The rising prices are a boon for the pharmaceutical industry. For example, 80% of the growth in profits of the 20 largest drug companies came from price increases, not from new drugs, just from raising the prices on their existing drugs. And these prices are causing real pain for patients, for the healthcare system, and for governments. So if you think about the drug that was discussed earlier, Gilead's hepatitis C drug, which cost $84,000 to treat a single patient. The state of California reportedly has spent $387 million. That's $387 million just for one drug, and just for one drug that has been out only for 3 years. You can imagine what those kinds of costs do for a healthcare system, and that's only one drug, and it's not by far the most expensive drug that's out there right now. So to put it simply, states are increasingly being forced to choose between patient health and staying afloat, and that is true for states as well as for individual patient budgets. This is a complex issue, but there are key drivers. One is what I would call extending the protection cliff. So patents are supposed to last for a limited amount of time, after which generics are supposed to enter the market and drive prices down. That's not what's happening. Rather, drug companies are piling new protections onto their drugs, one after another, pushing the protection cliff out farther and farther. So I released yesterday a comprehensive study analyzing all drugs on the market between 2005 and 2015, and tracking every time a company extended its protection cliff on any drug. And the results were stunning. Rather than creating new medicines, drug companies are largely recycling and repurposing older ones. So, across that period of time, 2005 to 2015, 77% of the drugs associated with new patents were not new drugs coming on the market, they were existing drugs. In other words, we are lavishing rewards on existing drugs, allowing companies to keep extending their competition-free zones and blocking competitions, which is what is part of what's keeping prices so high. Now, extending the protection cliff is particularly pronounced among best-selling drugs. So of the roughly 100 best-selling drugs, 76% extended their protection cliff at least once, and almost half extended the protection cliff more than once. Now, among the many ways to extend the protection cliff, getting an orphan drug designation was particularly popular. A drug doesn't have to be new to get an orphan drug designation, and the designation gives you 7 more years of protection. It's a little like winning the lottery if you are a drug company. And our study showed that the number of old drugs adding an orphan drug exclusivity has tripled between 2005 and 2015. And actually, if you look at the period from 2010 to 2015, it's quadrupled. It's become very popular in a very short period of time. Now, why is it bad to recycle and repurpose all old drugs, to make small changes in drugs and then get some new protections for them as well? There's different things that are going on, but different questions that I hear. So tweaking an existing drug, like some of the descriptions you've heard before, may be enough to get you through the Patent and Trademark Office, but there may be very little effect for the patients who are involved. this is particularly true for getting something like an orphan drug designation at the FDA. So the FDA has said that in order to get this drug designation, the orphan drug designation, you don't have to show that there's a patient benefit at all. In other words, you get a marvelous new protection, but you don't have to show that you've actually given anything for it. We are lavishing these rewards without asking for very much in return. In short, the misuse of the patent and regulatory systems isn't limited to a few pharma bad apples. It's not Martin Shkreli, it's not just Valiant. It is business as usual throughout the industry, and as the previous speaker pointed out, it's the policies that we have in place that are incentivizing companies to do this. Prices stay high because companies extend the protection cliff and block competition. A second key driver is what I would call formulary and rebate games. Now, most people don't pay cash for their medicines. Most people have some form of health insurance. So the actual price paid for a drug, that is what the patient pays and what the plan pays, is usually determined by third-party intermediaries. You've heard them referred to as PBMs. And that's true for private plans like Kaiser and Cigna, and for Medicare plans administered by state governments. It's true for health plans that cover government employees, and for private companies that self-insure like Google and Walmart. Now, these pricing contracts are incredibly complex, and they are highly secretive. The entities paying the bills, such as Kaiser or Walmart, don't know what they are actually paying for each drug. And that's because the entity paying generally just gets a rebate check at the end of the year covering multiple drugs. So those paying have no idea. And more than that, they're not permitted to know the individual price of the drugs. There are gag rules in the intermediary contracts, and I have talked to companies that have tried to negotiate their way around these gag rules, even asking just for permission to have auditors look at them, and the answer has been absolutely not. We won't allow you to have information on what the per drug price is. However, the details of these contracts are just beginning to spill out in court cases, and from these we can tease out a series of games to keep cheaper competitors out of the market. So the cheaper drugs are either excluded from the formulary, meaning you can't get reimbursed, or they're disadvantaged in a number of ways. Now, these secret drug deals are the opposite of what we want for society and for patients. A third key factor is consolidation in various healthcare industries. That includes the hospital industry, the generic drug industry, and the third-party intermediary industry, the PBMs I just mentioned. There are only 3 major PBMs in the country. When there aren't many players in an industry, consumers always suffer, and that is what we're seeing now. So I'd like to step back for a minute and say, what can the states do? Isn't this just a federal problem? Is there any role that states can play in this? And the answer is absolutely. There are very important roles that states can and should be playing. And I'd like to outline a few areas in which state activity by the legislature and regulatory bodies could go a long way towards easing the problems that we're talking about. The first is transparency, because a little sunshine goes a long way. Competition thrives on information, and in contrast, the kind of game playing I've just described thrives on secrecy that makes such strategies difficult to detect and to combat. States can help with transparency in several ways. So first, states may be able to require pharmaceutical companies and third-party intermediaries to disclose cost and agreement information. That's particularly true when the state is paying the bill, such as with Medicaid programs and state employee health care programs. Those are ripe for the governments to say, you should make this information known to us and to the public. It may also be true with private insurance plans to the extent that they are regulated through the state. Second, pharmacy substitution laws, that is when a generic can be substituted for a brand name drug. These are all state-based, and they are the subject of some of the game-playing techniques that I described. States may be able to both regulate those games and require greater transparency through the legislative systems and the regulatory systems that surround this, as well as impose penalties on those who abuse the state processes. Third, so-called patient advocacy groups are frequently funded by pharmaceutical companies themselves. Now, this poses a conflict of interest about when the group lobbies for state policies that favor those pharmaceutical companies who are funding the group. States may be able to enact sunshine laws requiring donors to the patient advocacy groups so that when a patient advocacy group appears before a state agency or a state regulatory body, they have to reveal information about where their funding comes from. Another possible area for state action concerns application of state antitrust laws. States can pursue antitrust actions against pharmaceutical companies or against the third-party intermediaries, the PBMs, for anti-competitive behavior. In addition, State Attorney General has the power to allow in-state mergers to go forward on the condition of conduct remedies supervised by the state. So those remedies can, in turn, include transparency requirements and competition requirements. There's a lot of power in the State House. Some of these state actions that I have mentioned touch on issues of federalism, that is, the extent to which state action may be circumscribed by federal activity. This is a devilishly difficult area that I promise I'm not going to describe right now, but I do want to say I'm happy to recommend resources that would be helpful for any of you who are contemplating and trying to understand this area. And finally, here is a list of selected works of mine on the topic of pharmaceutical pricing games. I'm happy to share if it's helpful to anyone. I would like to end on just one final note. The drug pricing is causing real pain for patients and for state and local government budgets, and states really do have a critical role to play in this arena. We need you. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much to our panelists. Thank you to the audience for your questions. And I'd ask, you've been such an excellent audience so far. Just one more thing to ask of you is that you let the panelists migrate to the reception and bring your questions in there, and let's all get
let
together.
them clean up.